I'm wondering what it really seems to have come down to is a jury. The purpose of a jury, as I always understand it, is to make sure the kind of nonsense that went on in this trial with secret evidence and entrapment and sort of things like that is it doesn't take place. It doesn't succeed in having a miscarriage of justice. I wonder what was going on with the jury. I mean, was it that there was this disconnect here? Did they see that there were these foreigners that had to be dealt with? I mean, what's going on here?
Let me just take a quick crack at that, because of course it's a real tough question. I am very reluctant to criticize juries because I happen to really believe strongly in the jury system. I think it's a tremendous safeguard against abuse. And however, I also think that sometimes juries can only decide the questions that are presented to them. And sometimes questions that are presented to them are really very difficult or impossible to decide. I think the classic one was the breast implant jury that was asked to decide whether it was negligent to have, for a medical company to do breast implants, and they decided yes it was, and then 10 years later everybody said, oops, they were wrong, maybe we can do it again. And it's not because this wasn't a good jury and they weren't working hard, but it was just that having to work through so much medical information with big names and confusing conclusions is just very hard for a jury that doesn't have medical training. And in this case, what the jury was asked to do essentially was to make decisions about the dangerousness and radicalness of two men from a Muslim background, a foreign country, based on translations of documents that were taken out of context, that were sort of cherry-picked, and using concepts of Islam that would have been very hard, I think, for most scholars in the United States to decide. And I think anyone that sat through that trial would have had to said, all of that material was very confusing. It was hard to decide exactly what the weight of it all was. And I think it's unfair to do to a jury to frankly ask them to make that kind of a decision based on that kind of evidence. There was some questions that came up as to some of the evidence that came in, and I just think that these questions will have to be reviewed on appeal, and the court will have to decide whether or not it was appropriate to ask the jury to do that. I think that's about the best you can do with it.
Jurors and the Muslim community here in the United States have an interesting relationship. We've done juror questionnaires on a number of these so-called terrorism cases, and if I could sit there and show you the responses, you would be shocked. There are some folks who have such a violent reaction to the term Islam, to the idea of a Muslim, and these are in cities like New York or in Alexandria, Virginia, places where you would think you have a very educated population, but you still have these very visceral negative reactions. And it doesn't matter if the person's from Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or born and raised in the United States. If they are Muslim, and if they are connected to the words Muslim and Islam, they are the enemy. And while that's not everybody, I would say that's a good 30% to 40% of the juror questionnaires that we randomly went through. And there's probably only about 10 or 15% that said they had a great image or even a positive image of Muslims. So I think that over the last few years, and I don't mean just since September 11th, but I think in the last 2 decades, with the problems that have gone on in the Middle East, the U.S. Has seen through the media nothing other than Muslims committing acts of violence, or which may be struggles, which may be legitimate struggles in some parts of the world, but that 20-second clip on the evening news is of a bunch of guys who look dark, carrying banners and yelling and screaming "Death to America" and burning the U.S. flag, and that's all they see. So I think a big part of it is that the Muslim community has to get out there and be much more proactive on interacting with their neighbors. And I don't mean just the big organizations like CARE and those groups. I mean on an individual level. The guy who runs the corner store selling coffee needs to know the guy next door to him. He needs to know his clients. They need to interact more. They need to be less insular than they have been up until now. And the second thing is that it's important for non-Muslims to have an open mind and understand, look, there have been characterizations of ethnic groups throughout the history of this country. And we've always ended up apologizing for it and being wrong. So let's not wait another 20, 30 years before we all say our mea culpas. Let's just understand now that we could be making a mistake and looking at these folks through a filter that isn't true, somebody else's agenda. So let's not have somebody else decide what we think. Let's do it ourselves. Let's step out there. Let's shake somebody's hand who looks like a Muslim and talk to him and find out what he believes. And I think that is what would make the difference in educating jurors. And I don't think it's going to happen in the courtroom. It's going to happen outside the courtroom.